like this, man. He's like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down in the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man. The dust and wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's like this all the time.
All right, Isaac Young, welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
Pretty good. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, definitely. I feel bad, as I often say. It took me so long to get you on here because I'd heard good things about you. And then finally, when I reached out and got a manuscript of your most recent book, I was honestly completely blown away. It's very good. Obviously, that's not the entire reason why we're here is to talk about your new book, but I just want to say that off the get-go. You're a very talented writer, and I'm really looking forward to speaking to you. But I'm familiar with who you are and your work, but some of my audience would not be. So, what do you do, Isaac?
So, basically, I'm a fiction writer. I'm currently on Twitter and Substack. I've done a lot of cultural commentary. Basically, how I like to brand myself is as a author on the distant right. I'm looking to reconstruct old virtues and old virtues apart from modernist deconstruction.
So yeah, you've mentioned off air that you're relatively young. So I'm curious, right? How do you get to this corner of the internet, right? How do you fall down this rabbit hole?
I started off as I think a lot of other guys on the distant right do. I was a lurker for several years. I followed several YouTube channels. I was on Twitter for a few months before I actually created an account and started talking and speaking. I kind of created created my account to spread my fiction around as a way of just trying to share it with the public. I'd say it was a fairly organic process as I kind of got into the sphere, and I don't know, it kind of just happened naturally,
No, definitely. So were you always kind of driven to create, or is that something you went about more, I guess, deliberately?
Oh, I was always want to be a writer. I remember when I was in middle school, I created these quite terrible short stories, as one does in middle school, but refined my craft a lot over the years until I was able to create something that was actually truly worthy of being shared. I think my first book I wrote in college, and that was a fantasy book. It didn't get published, sadly. Some stuff happened behind the scenes. I did a science fiction book, and that's the one I'm currently most known for, called The Matryoshka Divide. And that saw a good amount of success. And after that, I kind of wanted to step back into the fantasy realm, and I wrote Domes of Calrathia, which is my newest release and the one you've read.
So you mentioned that you are always kind of drawn to life as a writer, but I'm curious, who are your biggest influences, right? The men you sort of look to.
So I actually, I've mentioned this to you earlier behind the scenes, but Gene Wolfe is one of my favorite authors. I've actually read him fairly late in the game. I didn't even know who he was up until I think about 2 years ago. And then someone recommended to me Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe. And I was like, this looks like a really interesting story. It's set in the Dying Earth genre. It's about a society that's currently going through civilizational collapse, and it engages in all these interesting ideas. It's such an exotic setting with strange characters, bizarre landscapes, all that, and I was just captivated by it. And that's probably the biggest inspiration behind Domes of Calrathia is Gene Wolfe and his style of literature.
Yeah, I've spoken. I think I did at least 2 episodes. I know I did one with John Slaughter about Gene Wolfe. Gene Wolfe has a very unique. I mean, to say fantasy is probably not doing the man justice. He has a very unique style and subject that I find super fascinating. And obviously, there are a lot of motifs from his work in yours. Gene Wolfe is kind of an odd guy personally, right? Perhaps most notable technically for inventing Pringles, and then obviously for his fiction work as well. But as far as I understand, Wolfe is or was, I guess, Catholic. If you don't mind me asking, do you have a religious background?
I do. I'm also very much Catholic.
Well, I'll put it this way: it comes across in your work. And so is that something you sort of resonated with in Wolfe?
Yeah, I would say the problem with a lot of religious fiction that a lot of people on the right have noticed is that religious fiction exists to evangelize and not to tell good stories. And I've always felt this, especially since I went through Sunday school. I was put through all the usual classes. I was shown the usual movies, and all of them except for The Passion were basically just terrible, just awful movies, and they just, for me personally, they just made my skin crawl at times. And particularly, I wanted to be able to tell stories that engaged in religious themes without all that baggage which we normally associate with religious stories.
Yeah, this is definitely something I have found irritating as well. Obviously, I was raised in the kind of evangelical world, which is sort of infamous for this. Maybe just because of your age and being on the internet, have you ever been exposed to the wonderful world of Bible Man?
No, I haven't.
Okay, you're gonna have to look this up because this is gonna sound fake, but it's 100% real. So basically, Bible Man was created in response to kind of the first generation of superhero movies in the early 2000s. Stuff like, Blade and the Spider-Man movies and the Fantastic Four and like the Nolan Batman movies. And it was basically the super cool Christian version of a superhero. And he's in a kind of like purple and silver outfit with like the Bible on his chest, and he uses a sword. And it's very much embarrassing, right? It looks like everything is made with kind of like, spirit Halloween costumes. And in addition to just not being particularly artfully done, you're 100% right. Like it is the most embarrassing form of like Sunday school evangelism. And obviously I'm not trying to disparage the ideas. They were, I assume, attempted in good faith, but they are very embarrassing and they're not very good fiction. And so I certainly share your objections to the vast majority of so-called like religious inspired fiction, if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah, I'd say the majority of that sort of crowd, their time would be better spent at the pulpit rather than behind a camera or writing a book. If you're going to write essays, just write the essay.
Yeah, so I am for the sake of my YouTube viewers, so they know I am not joking. This is Bible Man right here. And the airbrush is doing him a lot of favors. You see, this property is still around. Yeah, it started in the late 90s, I guess. But yeah,
oh my gosh. It's like Power Rangers.
It is. And it kind of went through, like I'm saying, they're still making it. This property still exists.
Oh, it still exists?
Yeah, now it's like an animated series.
Oh
yeah, this is exactly the look I'm talking about with his sword. They made these for a long time. But anyway, so point is, right, that's an extreme version of it, but I know exactly what you're talking about. And it is always difficult, right? Because it feels like, you have ideas, you want to express them. Fiction could be a powerful tool for that. So how do you kind of thread the needle between, representing true ideas and not coming across as didactic?
Um, I guess I'll start from the most superficial standpoint. So the way I've kind of processed it is I'm trying to get away from Ned Flanders' Christianity as much as I possibly can. And I airbrush everything out that could possibly be a passing resemblance to that sort of Christianity. You know who Ned Flanders is, correct? From The Simpsons?
Yes, I do. Sorry, computer is having issues. This has been I've recorded 3 episodes today, and this has been an issue in all of them, but I will edit it out so no one will know. Sorry, Isaac.
But yeah, it's I'm trying to literally everything I can possibly do to get away from that. I think Christianity has been all the strong elements have been filtered out in modern culture, and all that's left is this extremely shallow, nice guy, hippie Jesus sort of Christianity, which is purely a modern invention. It does not bear any relation to historical Christianity. And what I try to do in my work is I try to bring out those pre-modern truths which exist in the religion. And yeah, that's I'd say that's the first step. And I would say the second step is you definitely don't want your characters to be preaching towards the audience. If you're going to reflect moral lessons, they should be inbuilt into the narrative rather than a monologue your character has at the end of the story, where they recite all the lessons you're supposed to take away. And I guess the third lesson would be, I guess I'll come back to my main point. Fiction should be fiction. It shouldn't be essays. And if you're trying to write an essay, you ought to just write the essay. Fiction is something that is entirely different. It's artistic in the sense that it opens up the reader to many sorts of interpretations of the text, and trying to cram your message down a person's throat is only going to drive them away. That's all I can come up with at the top of my head.
Well, and that's not to say that, there is such a thing as kind of like neutral art, right? Art free of value. Because, I think one of the things that a lot of the kind of like anti-woke media analysis figures, right, pick your poison, incorrectly assume is that, media before a certain era had no quote unquote politics in it, right? It was just pure entertainment. And that's obviously not the case, right? There's an inbuilt system of values to any narrative. And so obviously, I think you've done a fairly decent job of kind of distancing yourself from the kind of like the Flanders version of Christianity. But on the other hand, like, how do you see your kind of, shall we say, traditional Christian values in your work?
I would say that the problem of Ned Flanders' Christianity is that it assumes that there's no great struggle in life, whereas real Christianity embraces the cross. And I think that's something that authors ought to particularly reflect upon, especially in the modern day, where there's a whole host of suffering and pain and misery because of vast mistakes that our culture has made. And if you want to truly reach people in your art, you ought to be able to engage with them honestly instead of pretending that those issues don't exist. If I were to give an example, I would say an easy one off the top of my head is I've watched several movies from like the 90s, and they depict nuclear families who are, stable, who are maybe not lovingly married, but married, and providing a foundation for children to grow up in. That's not an assumption, and that's not a default assumption you can say of modern families today. And I think if you're trying to write a modern story in terms of trying to reach an audience today, you need to be able to tackle that reality, even though it brings up some very nasty things about humanity.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And this is something I need to publish this. I'm technically have a Substack that I've been horribly neglecting, and actually have a fully finished essay, really on a similar topic, right? That look, obviously, right, the Christian conception of the world is ultimately a comedy, right? In the sense that, in the end, justice is done, things are put right, and it ends with a wedding, right? A symbolic wedding between Christ and his church. So, ultimately, right, Christians have a technically like a rosy view of the future, right? But the here and now can be, quite unpleasant. There is very real suffering. And that kind of Ned Flanders Christianity, which is basically, God wants Christians to be generally pleasant people, right? And he will reward them with a nice life, right? Is not only completely ahistorical, but that if you were outside of that context, you were outside of your kind of like limited faith. And, obviously it's interesting you bring up the Passion of the Christ, right? Because that's a very, very uncomfortable kind of movie, right? There's a lot of flat out torture in it, right? And it's not gratuitous in the sense that it's not some of these like torture porn movies, like, pick your poison, right? Of kind of like slop. But it's because that's a real fact of both obviously the story of Christ, but also of human experience, right? Things are bad. Things are negative. And so when we talk about heroes, right, and ultimately, right, as Christ is kind of like the highest archetype of, both the warrior and the priest as the two kind of cardinal male archetypes. Well, we kind of inhabit a smaller version of that, right? And so there is a sense to which, self-sacrifice, the ability to overcome pain, is completely necessary for heroic action. And if you take that out of a narrative, you're left with nothing, right? It's hollow, especially in masculine narratives.
Yeah, I would say the only pain Ned Flanders goes through is just to put up his demeanor of being pleasant. That's the only sort of suffering he can kind of internalize. Meanwhile, real Christian suffering is you have to deal with a lot of nasty, brutal realities. And in the case of the Passion, outright torture. And that's something that Ned Flanders Christianity can't even comprehend. It would not, out of any other context than the 90s, Ned Flanders Christianity could not and would not have survived.
Well, right. And even in the 90s, it was sort of an anachronism, right? It was a callback to an America that was already gone. I mean, that's why Ned Flanders is a joke, right? He's an anachronism. He belongs to a different era. And, you see this a lot in religious communities, especially among older people, right? Which is they just want everything to be pleasant and nice and normal like it was when they were children. And from a certain perspective, I don't really blame them, right? I would much rather live in a culture where even if they weren't particularly devout, roughly 70% of people went to church regularly and thought that was an important thing, at least to be seen doing, right? Which is much better than a society in which people have no common virtue whatsoever. But nonetheless, it's not real. And I think that's one of the big disconnects between us and our elders, right? And it's one of the reasons why I genuinely have resonated so deeply with Gene Wolfe, right? Because not only are, his heroes very flawed, and not in the kind of like obnoxious, edgy, Zack Snyder 2000 sense of like, oh, the hero says bad words, but like these are essentially broken men through whom great things are accomplished basically by God's will. And that's a very fascinating story. It's a very interesting thing to look at. To take this back, I guess, to a different direction, I'm going to do something I only do occasionally and say something nice about our Orthodox bros here, which is I actually think that they have because of their kind of unique historical heritage, have a very healthy understanding of suffering that particularly, Western Christians who have not had to suffer very much have lost.
Yeah, I definitely agree. There's something to the Orthodox digital presence which is far stronger than Catholics. This is not to go against the Catholic faith by any means. As a Catholic, I hold the Catholic Church as the one true church. But there's definitely something there in terms of there's at least an aesthetic of something that is a lot more compelling than people give it credit for.
This is a complete and total aside and not the point of this podcast, but I will say it. I find probably 95% of Christian conversations on the internet to be incredibly irritating and pointless, which is, again, like I said, not at all the point of this podcast. But I'll put it this way. Much like how we mentioned that a lot of these kind of like didactic fiction writers would be better served in a pulpit, something similar could be said to recent online converts on the internet, and I'll probably leave it there. So one of the other things I really enjoy, and this is kind of a through line in fiction that I really appreciate, whether it's Frank Herbert or Gene Wolfe, who we mentioned, or your work, is you do a very good job, as well as those men do, of creating an sort of an alternative world where the people who live there have an alternative set of values to that practice in the West. And one of my biggest pet peeves, right, is to be, transported to a, sort of this fantastic medieval world where everyone talks like they got a writing degree at, NYU. They have the exact same set of values and values and sensibilities as a progressive in 2020. And so,
of course, they talk exactly like a person in 2020 would, with all the vulgarity and irony.
Oh yeah, 100%. It drives me absolutely up the walls. And so I wanted to, one, congratulate you on that, and then two, ask, like, is that something you approached deliberately?
On one hand, there is a certain element that is deliberate. On the other hand, I think I've simply read from a lot of older authors who did not write with that voice, and that just rubbed off on mine. I find that I kind of really struggle with writing contemporary prose. I've noticed that a lot of my stuff comes off as like if H.P. Lovecraft would have written it. And I've read a lot of H.P. Lovecraft. I've also read a lot of Edgar Allan Poe, Edgar Rice Burroughs, all those sorts of authors, and that kind of just bled through into my style.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, because I think especially when you're starting out in any art form, right? There's a lot of imitation that goes into it. And you can tell almost instantly when someone has read widely and when they haven't in their own work. And I'm not going to throw this under the bus. This was something I enjoyed quite a bit as a 10 and 12-year-old. Did you ever read Christopher Paolini's Eragon books? They were big, like probably when we were in middle school.
My gosh. You're giving me like PTSD flashbacks towards high school. Like I read those books like freaking gospel.
Well, then
I'm not proud I read those books.
Then this is exactly the age difference than you and I, because I think the last one came out when I was in 9th grade. But right, like, look, those were fine. There's nothing really objectionable about them as things you read as a young teenager, right? But let's be honest, those are not high art, right? There's no pretension to really something greater. And look, I get it. The guy wrote the first one when he was like 15. Look, again, I'm not trying to be overly punitive, but I do think it's interesting that you can tell when someone is well read. Again, I keep going back to Gene Wolfe because his work compares well to yours, and I mean those books are incredibly literary, right? You don't need to get all of the allusions, and I certainly don't. But if you've ever seen the annotated versions of his work, they're incredibly, incredibly dense, and I think that sort of that ability to index with more than just the like recent authors in a certain piece of, or like a certain genre of fiction, really adds to a work a lot.
Yeah, I would note that I think there's a little bit else going on there with Eragon, because we could say Edgar Rice Burroughs' Princess of Mars, or Tarzan, or Robert E. Howard's Conan the Barbarian. We could say that those were, trashy, low level, low art style, books, but they've had an enduring presence, which Eragon doesn't have in the slightest. And I think that's because, those authors, we might consider them, low art or crass or however you want to put it, but they were tapping into something real that I think is lost on a lot of modern literature. I think, I think the problem with Eragon is that it's derived entirely from, I don't want to say slop, but it's derived entirely from Star Wars type media.
Well, right, it didn't take any derivative.
Of those. Oh, sorry. It's derivative, and it doesn't connect to anything that's true in the author's experience. Maybe that's a good way of putting it. I don't know. There's always something about Eragon that doesn't strike me as permanent in the way that those other books were.
So the reason I actually brought up Eragon is because the last leg of my flight, when I was finishing up your book, there was this kid who is, I live in a college town, right? And the college I live near has this event where a bunch of, high school seniors who want to come to the school get to go there for a weekend, right? Pretty standard. And so I know exactly this kind of kid who's like a homeschooled kid, seemed like, a sweet guy and everything. But it was interesting because he was reading Eragon, right? Had the big, like the exact same, I assume, big hardcover, like red book that I think was the second one, right? You know exactly what cover I'm referring to.
Eldest.
Yeah. And it was just this incredibly funny moment of like, from a certain perspective, you and I are doing the same thing, but this is a very different experience. But I wanted to actually go back to something. Have you ever read Jonathan Bowden's book on pulp?
I have not.
Oh, you really like it. There's an audio version of it available somewhere. It's a collection of probably 15 different speeches he gave that were transcribed into a book. It's very, very good. And he basically goes through certain kind of archetypal, characters or ideas in pulp fiction, right? Not the movie from the 90s, right? But the actual genre. And so he starts, obviously he goes through Howard, he goes through Morlock, he goes through all of these kind of like seminal writers in that field. And the argument he makes in that book, and he goes through, different kind of supporting examples, is basically that, as culture changed, these kind of older, truer ideas that we're talking about became publicly unacceptable, right? You couldn't talk about those in prestige fiction. And so those are still real. Those are still part of the human experience. And so those ideas had to go somewhere. And they went into, pulp fiction, right? This kind of like mass market, kind of like sword and sorcery in the case of Conan, or, in a character like Solomon Kane, something more horror tinged, but have, real genuine ideas in them, like concepts of kind of like savagery and nobility that are very human, right? You can see in the Western canon, but you won't get you won't get on the New York Times bestsellers writing a book that has, those kind of themes in them. And, Bowden does a very convincing job of that. And I think that, you're 100% right. Like we could say like, oh, Conan is low fiction, quote unquote, but there is something kind of true and enduring in that.
Yeah. And, I guess this is a good segue into talking about, a lot of, I'm not the only one who's noticed there's a huge conversation that happens every 2 to 3 months or so. Someone goes into a Barnes and Noble, takes a picture of what they're selling on the front shelves, and then the internet has an existential crisis over what's been going on in our literary scene for the past 20 years. And it's either smut, LGBTQ rights activism stuff, or really pretentious liberal bullshit. And that's all they're selling in the mainstream. And to get on your idea of like ideas being gradually unacceptable to deal with, I think we've gotten to a point where mainstream publishing is just unable to interface with reality in any other way than the most vulgar and debased and narcissistic art. And the only authors who are left doing actually good work are just in the indie sphere.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something you've seen across all media, right? Is that, as our kind of like cultural institutions fray and fall apart, the prestige institutions lose their ability to create anything good or anything worthwhile. And so again, it's part of the reason I was really excited to read your work, is it's genuinely good, and not just good because you and I share similar politics, right? And that's always the promise of like indie spaces, right? Like, oh, this is where new and great ideas come up. But what you're getting is something unfiltered, right? And so, you'll find good books, you'll find great books, but you'll also find a lot of trash. And I mean, that's true of anything, but it is exciting to see like, oh, this is no longer just a talking point of, oh, we'll build our own. Like, there are real and there are interesting authors in the space.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there are a lot of benefits to indie. For example, I have complete creative control. There was a discussion earlier about book covers and how book covers have become feminized. If you look into like a modern book cover of Dune, for example, instead of having, these savage Fremen and Paul Atreides on the cover, you have basically this really abstract cover of just a bunch of sand dunes going up. And that's, it doesn't tell you anything really of the book. It's abstract. It's completely washed out. And I wanted to buck that trend. So I went to an artist and I basically said, all right, here's my idea of what I want for a book cover. And I had an image in my head from the get-go. It's this guy in a blue cloak. He's holding a flaming sword, and he's basically going up against and fighting these unholy abominations. And you can see that in all of its detail from the front cover. It tells you exactly what my book is about, just from a first glance. And that's one of the benefits of indie, is I get to do that, and I don't have any interference.
Well, and that's its own thing that's kind of interesting, right? And you've seen this in cinema, is the death of the auteur, right? The death of, the one guy who calls the shots. And I think that that's something you need to make great art, right? Great art is very rarely, if ever, created by committee. Do you see that what I'm getting at there?
Oh yeah, you get, all right. Like, your chances of writing a good book go exponentially down with how many authors you include in the equation. You can pretty much all the good books are written by one author. You can squeak away with 2. By 3, you're pretty much done, and by 4, it's going to be a mess.
Yeah, and that's sort of an interesting point. I had a conversation with Will Tanner, where we kind of talked about like the economy and ownership. And this is something that, James Burnham identified, right? Where he described, this kind of like managerial revolution where you move away from capitalism, which, we can certainly have our critiques of. But a capitalist is a guy who owns something, right? In 1920, it's very easy to say who is in charge of Ford Motor Company, right? It's a guy named Ford. Whereas now, who's in charge of Ford Motor Company? It's like, well, there's probably a guy named Ford sitting on the board of directors somewhere, but is he really in charge, right? And you see a similar kind of like muddying effect where if no one owns something, if no one's really in charge, right, you don't get that same kind of focused output. I mean, you could make a similar point about governance. I mean, I know some have, you could look at kind of like Hoppe's, takedown of democracy and, Democracy, the God That Failed. But, it's something you see in art as well, right? And so, earlier we talked about the kind of, the way in which every hero reflects Christ in some way. Well, similarly, right, every sort of, creative or generative effort reflects the kind of like the sovereignty of God, right? You were making order out of something. And obviously to a greater or lesser degree, but it is something that I think is interesting to discuss.
Yeah, that's Tolkien's subcreation. Basically, what an author is doing is mimicking in some small way God's creation through his own mind.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring up Tolkien, right? Because I think that the last big kind of fantasy property that really like took the world by storm was Game of Thrones, right? Which is, literally, if you listen to George R. Martin, right, a deliberate kind of inversion and takedown of Tolkien's view of the world, right? The line that always gets repeated is, what is Aragorn's tax policy? And one, I just want to say that is an impressive level of missing the point, right? But I do think there's some kind of great irony in the fact that that show ended very poorly. It was an absolute mess. And he as a man seems unable to finish his own work, right? That subversion cannot create, a full story.
Well, I definitely agree that line is definitely one of the biggest pieces of midwittery to come out of, the past decade. I think there is actually a bit of a kernel of truth in that. I don't think that George R. Martin built Game of Thrones off of pure subversion for subversion's sake. I think I think the kernel that's in A Song of Ice and Fire is this idea that Christianity is, and to get to kind of circling all the way back around to the beginning, that there's a lot of Christians out there who aren't portraying the world as it is, and they're covering up a lot of ugly truths for the sake of niceties and pleasantness. And I don't think George R. R. Martin would have gotten the cultural traction if he did, if Christians weren't covering up those ugly truths. And I think that the Lord of the Rings takedown was just incidental and a misfire, because he didn't even really understand Lord of the Rings as a property. It's a mythopoetic property. It's not a property in terms of trying to deal with contemporary issues.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I'd like to hear you expand more on that idea of Christians kind of covering something up.
Well, I mean, what's in George R. R. Martin's books? There's rape, fornication, incest, bestiality, a lot of extraordinarily ugly things that, any decent author would avoid. And I think Christians ought not to delve into those things in terms of presenting them without modesty and extreme delicacy, but in terms of being unable to broach those topics and condemning them, you're kind of just leaving authors to be like, oh, I'm going to subvert this. It's going to be new and shocking, and I'm going to cover ground you won't dare tread and comment on topics you won't dare talk about. And that provided a lot of cultural energy in the 2010s. I mean, Game of Thrones sold itself as the show that was going to go into the difficult issues and discuss them realistically in it presented itself as sort of trying to get at a moral ground in those difficult issues. I think it was cynical. It was very, very, very cynical. But it was hinting at, and only recently revealed as completely hollow, but it was hinting at this moral fiber that was going to resolve things in the end. And it didn't have that. But in terms of what Christians can learn from that, I would say that Christians ought to be able to tackle those extremely difficult topics, which are relevant today, because we see them every day in our modern lives, and being able to discuss those delicately, and also being able to have a firmness and condemn evil, which I did not see growing up. It was always a very rose-tinted glasses on reality.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, that, right? That, that desire to kind of stick your head in the sand, say everything goes back to normal. It's understandable, but fundamentally you're missing, a part of human existence, right? And it's easy to say, and you've heard this, right, from, certain conservatives or religious, like, oh, XYZ piece of art is sinful, right, is anathema because it has bad things in it. I had a conversation with my wife about this, because she had never seen the original Blade Runner film. And so, we watched it together, and she was disturbed by it. Yeah, it is kind of a disturbing film, but it produced a really kind of valuable conversation, because obviously, there are things in that are not strictly speaking moral, right? But they're not shown to be good or admirable, right? You're sort of seeing into like a vision of hell, right? This is a bad thing that ought to be avoided. And so I think that is the kind of duty, right, is to both, take up these kind of like gross or, unpleasant topics, but also, to portray them accurately. And that doesn't mean to create this kind of like medieval morality play, where the devil comes on stage and, drags the fornicator screaming into hell. But to say, like, look, like, these are things humans do with consequences. And I'm oversimplifying it, but that's a dimension that's often lost.
Yeah, I would say that a lot of the modernist authors, what they're really good at getting at is these depictions of just utter hell in every single way. George R. Martin was great at it. I mean, what is Game of Thrones if not a depiction of hell for about 5 or 6 seasons until it totally goes off the rail into just nonsense?
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point, right? Because if you have that with no redemption, with nothing as kind of like a spark in it, it's kind of completely hopeless and miserable. Like the books that come to mind is have you ever read 2666 by Bolaño, I think?
I have not.
I wouldn't recommend it. It's basically a 1,200 page catalog of like horrifying crimes and terrible people in northern Mexico, right? There's there's probably 50 just very graphic crime scene descriptions scattered throughout the book. But the problem is, right, there's no redemption to it. There's no conclusion to the narrative. It just simply is, right? That's the world. And, you compare that to something that is kind of, you could view as equally as misanthropic, right? Which is something like Cormac McCarthy's, Blood Meridian, which also, has all the exact same content, all the same kind of like nastiness in it. But, there is a spark in the world, right? In McCarthy, right, he talks about the kind of like spark, the fire buried within the rock, right? That there is something pure and generative, but absent God, it's hell. And I think that's a fundamentally different narrative than just everything is awful and that's all there is.
Yeah, you get very graphic depictions of darkness. I'm reminded of I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, which I think captures honestly the best depiction of demons, except it's just an AI. But it's literally there's this speech, there's this monologue in I Have No Mouth. It's literally called the hate speech, and it's the AI's voicing his hatred for humanity. And if you swap it out for a demon, like, it is 1-to-1 amazing. Like, just how graphic it captures that darkness. And personally, I think I think depicting darkness for darkness's own sake is not a virtue. I think it did a lot of damage to the culture. I think that, insofar as you depict darkness, you should at least have a commensurate understanding of virtue and the light. And for a long time, our main culture has just been depicting darker and darker shades of darkness until we finally just arrived at the bottom, and our current authors are too incompetent to really say anything at all.
Yeah, and that's something that, you know, I've noticed, right? I wish I could remember what it was, but I read this kind of like French postmodern fiction a while back. I can't remember. It was the most absurdly French and postmodern thing I've ever read. Was it Television? I think that's what it was called. A miserable book written by, I assume, a miserable person. And there's something interesting to it, right? Like, okay, we've got this kind of sense of ennui. We've got this, kind of sense of nothing happening. And the problem is, right, if you just stick in that, it's like, okay, well, it's a mood piece. Okay, you've made me feel something. But you're telling me nothing more about the world than just, I feel bad. And I get that. I feel a certain amount of personal sympathy. But I think that kind of like endless navel gazing isn't really useful anymore. Like we've plumbed that depth. And so, one of the reasons I get really frustrated with what you could describe as like this kind of like glib Reddit nihilism, right, is that it's not interesting anymore, right? Celine was doing this in the 30s, right? This is a very played out thing. And so when you talk about, the kind of like absolute dross of modern fiction, which I certainly agree with, right? It, to me, in addition to being bad fiction, it's also incredibly tired, right? This is not a new exercise anymore.
Yeah, the left is, for a long time, they've defined art as anything that evokes emotion. And they went down this rabbit hole of this sensuousness of creating more and more provocative pieces of art until it's become so tired and exhausted. It's like a drug addict hitting shots of heroin, and he doesn't even get high anymore because his body is just so tolerant to it. And I think that stems from a misunderstanding of what art is. I don't think art is meant to evoke emotion, though that's certainly part of it. If art is simply anything that evokes emotion, then just go outside and look at the sky or passing cars or whatever. That it means nothing. That's not a definition. That's just the reality of experience evokes emotion. I think art is meant to elevate the soul towards God. And I think that's something that's dearly lost in modern fiction.
So, Isaac, we are fast coming up on time, as you can probably tell. I'm a little bit sick and my voice is giving out. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and like I said, I really enjoyed your work. But if people want to find more of your creative output, what's the best way for them to do that?
So all of my cultural commentary, I have a lot of articles discussing a lot of major properties. Particularly, I have a article on Adventure Time that seems to be getting a lot of traction recently. It's on Substack, Trantor Publishing. That's, yes, some might have guessed with my PFP, that's a reference to Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy. You can find my fiction on Royal Road. I recently moved my fiction over there. It's a better platform for fiction, even though it's not air quotes our guy type platform like Substack is. And I'm also on Twitter, and those are the three main places you can find me.
Well, definitely, man. I'm really looking forward to the launch of your book. I quite enjoyed it. I'll have all those links in the description. I highly recommend that everyone check them out. As far as my stuff, the Jay Burden Show is on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. If you want to support the show, the easiest way is to leave a review. That does help. And in addition, your reviews make me laugh. And I appreciate that. If you want to do something more concrete, obviously there are cryptocurrency links in the description, or you can head over to our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. Again, Isaac, I appreciate your time, and everyone at home, keep your head up. The light can't last forever. Good night.